It's a great pleasure to be part of this series. I've actually attended all the other talks in the series, and I can recommend them if they are on YouTube in the future. They are really excellent series of talks. I would like especially to thank Elizabeth Blood and Mark Downing for inviting me to be part of this series, and Elizabeth has done an enormous amount of work in making the lectures happen. So thank you very much, Elizabeth. And in particular for my own talk, I want to thank Bill Dunn, Richard Van Emden, Paul Zuckerman, and especially an Australian colleague, Deborah Beck. So my talk, unlike, in fact, I think almost all the other talks in the series, it's very much about one church monument. It focuses on a very particular monument in Storrington in West Sussex, and the title, as you can see, is Lost and Found, the Memorial to Francis Mond in St Mary's Church, Storrington, West Sussex. When I was first working on this lecture, back in 2018, I heard the roar of the RAF flypast celebrating 100 years of the RAF outside my office window in South Kensington. An extraordinarily appropriate event, as I hope you'll agree, as the narrative of Francis Mond unfolds. I want to explore the church monument to Francis Mond through this singular example, and through this example we will find out about the death of a young pilot, his grieving mother Angela, and the legacies of her grief, both positive and negative. And they're seen primarily in this powerful monument erected in Francis's memory in the West Sussex village of Storrington. The memorial to Captain Francis Leopold Mond, who was born in 1896 and died in 1918, is on the northeast wall of St Mary's Church near the chancel. It is both prominent and obscure. Prominent because of its prime position in the church, not far from the high altar, and yet obscure because of the rather poor natural lighting. In fact, these photographs are a bit misleading because in reality, it's quite difficult to see the monument. This bold and moving work is therefore often overlooked by visitors. The guidebook to the church, for example, does not mention it. Yet its history is intensely poignant, and just as importantly, it is an extremely impressive monument sculpturally, worthy of the heroic young man it commemorates. It was the starting point of my research into Francis Mond's story. And in fact, I just happened to be in the church and noticed what a very impressive monument it was, and that's what led me to try and find out more about it. So my lecture today centres on that memorial and the daunting woman who was responsible for commissioning it, Francis's mother, Angela Primrose Hamilton Schweich Mond, née Goetze, who was born in 1871 and died in 1941, and this, as you can see, is a full-length portrait by Lynn Thorpe from 1910. I've said that Angela Mond was responsible for the monument, but the other agent in its creation was, of course, its sculptor, George Rayner Hoff. This talk will weave together the story of these three people, Francis and his bereaved mother, Angela, and the artist, Rayner Hoff. I want to say something about the Mond family in order to put the story of the monument into context. Inevitably, the ramifications of Angela's grief for her son killed in action extend beyond these two individuals. So let's start with Francis Mond himself. I'm going to give you a brief summary of Francis Mond's short life and his death, which occurred only a few months before the end of the First World War. Mond, the second eldest son of 5 children, had matriculated at Peterhouse, Cambridge University, before the outbreak of the war, and he signed up for military service while still at university in July 1914, volunteering for foreign service when war broke out soon afterwards. He was transferred to the Royal Flying Corps in February 1915, which was to become the Royal Air Force in April 1918. Early on in his military career, in autumn 1915, he had crashed from 100 feet, suffered concussion, and was invalided home. But he reported back for duty in 1916. On the 15th of May 1918, the young pilot, aged 22, was shot down again, this time fatally, in the Somme, northern France. He and his Canadian observer, Edgar Meath Martin, I'm sorry about this not very good photograph, but this is an early image of Edgar Martin. His Canadian observer and he were flying a DH-4 bomber and were on their way back to their base in France, having bombed German arms dumps near Bapaume. They were attacked by 3 German aircraft and their plane crashed a few hundred meters short of the Allied front in no man's land, where Australian troops were holding the line. So if you can see on this map, this is the Somme, so somewhere around here they crashed. An Australian soldier, Lieutenant Albert Hill, saw the crash just south of the Somme River and led men under fire to recover the 2 airmen. One was dead and the other may still have been alive at that point, but both had died by the time they were brought in. Lieutenant Hill took their effects to send to their relatives, labelled the bodies and sent them to the rear. A collection system for retrieving and burying the bodies was in operation and they were taken elsewhere. Francis's parents, Angela and Émile Mond, were told of his death and received his personal items. 6 months later, in November 1918, the war ended, and Angela and Émile wanted to visit their son's burial place in France. However, despite the bodies having been sent to a collection point once they had been retrieved by Lieutenant Hill, there was no apparent record of Francis's grave. His and Martin's bodies seemed to be missing. Angela Mond was determined to find her son. She contacted Edgar Martin's widow, you remember Edgar Martin was the Canadian observer, and started to make inquiries, interviewing people involved and visiting France on several occasions, searching 30 or 40 cemeteries. As a result, she became convinced that the 2 bodies had been misidentified and buried under the wrong names of another pilot and observer shot down on that same day in May 1918. Angela believed that Francis's and Edgar Martin's bodies was buried at Doullens Cemetery, about 30 miles from the crash, under erroneous names. She contacted the parents of Captain J.V. Aspinall, the pilot under whose tombstone she believed her son was in fact buried, and obtained permission to exhume his body. In fact, this was a very long, drawn-out process. Angela had to battle with the War Graves authorities for 3 years. They were extremely reluctant to alter the records and exhume the body. And it was partly due to the father of Captain Aspinall that she was eventually enabled to do this. Both she and Captain Aspinall's father were present when the exhumation took place in March 1923. The body they exhumed turned out indeed to be Angela's son. She identified it as Francis, while Captain Aspinall's father confirmed the body was not that of his son. They concluded that the body in the next grave must be Martin's rather than Lieutenant P.V. de la Cour, the other airman killed that day with Aspinall, whose name was on the headstone. We must assume then that there were no dog tags, which were a fairly recent introduction. The lack of such identity tags heightens the appalling experience of the identification process, viewing the decaying corpse of a loved one, given that wartime burials were still rudimentary in nature, even in prescribed and later lovingly tended graveyards. We can only wonder at the determination of Angela, the horrors she must have had to go through on that day and the effect they must have had on her. She did, however, succeed. As a result of her identification of Francis's body, the names on the written records were corrected. You can see here on the right where the two names have been correctly written in. And new headstones erected. So here are the new headstones. Martin's is inscribed, "Greater love hath no man than this," while Mond's epitaph on the left is, "Killed in aerial combat, il y a donc quelque chose de plus précieux de la vie, puisque nous sommes ici. There must therefore be something more precious than life, since we are here." A letter from the Imperial War Graves Commission of 30th of April 1923 to Angela confirms that the corrected records were to be inserted in the cemetery register and that the names on the headstones of both Francis's grave and Lieutenant Martin's would be amended. The other two airmen, Captain Aspinall and Lieutenant de la Cour, had been shot down in enemy territory and their bodies were never recovered. In the terrible melee after the two planes had crashed, the soldiers who took Mond's and Martin's bodies to the collection point on the 15th of May had evidently confused the identities of the four men shot down, hence the mix-up of names and the consequent erroneous records and headstones. Emile and Angela had already commissioned the monument to their son in Storrington Church, but they also bought the field where the crash had taken place and erected a monument to their son there. This is a broken column and base in sandstone inscribed "Ce monument est érigé à la mémoire du capitaine Francis L. Mond, RFA et RAF, et du Lieutenant Edgar M. Martin." And it then goes on, their squadron fell gloriously in this place, fighting the German planes, 15th of May, 1918. Per ardua ad astra, through adversity to the stars. That's, as you probably know, the RAF motto. So the long process of grieving, drawn out by the misidentification and amplified by the trauma of the exhumation and identification, began to be translated into physical form through memorialization. We've already seen the monument in Storrington, an outstanding work by an obviously brilliant sculptor, and not one that could have been afforded by many grieving parents. Clearly, Angela Mond was a woman of some determination, pursuing her indomitable course to recover and correctly identify her son's body over more than 3 years. She had the means and the intelligence to do so, but was her main driver perhaps the need to make sense of an unbearable loss, to find a way to live with the devastating truth that her 22-year-old son, still apparently suffering the chronic effects of his earlier air accident, including some residual bouts of dizziness, had nevertheless been welcomed back to active service and sent out across some of the deadliest territory on earth with a newly qualified observer, Edgar Martin, to his possibly inevitable death. I want now to look at the Monds, the family. Angela Mond and the Mond family were exceptional people and their power and wealth must have enabled Angela to succeed. Many were philanthropists with connections to the artistic and political world. Francis's paternal grandfather, so here's Francis, his paternal grandfather was Leopold Schweich, originally from Kassel in Germany. Leopold married Philippina Mond, and they had a son and daughter, Emile and Constance. So here's Emile and here's Constance. When Philippina died young in 1873, the two children were brought up by her brother, the chemist Ludwig Mond. So here's Ludwig, who is Philippina's brother, and his wife, Frida. So I've also actually got a little image of Ludwig Mond. This is a bronze statuette of Ludwig Mond by Edouard Lanteri from about 1909. So Emile and Constance were brought up with their cousins, Robert and Alfred. So that was Ludwig Mond's son. Emile took the name Mond and became a chemist, like his uncle Ludwig, and like his two cousins, Robert and Alfred. Sorry. So there you can see there's Robert and Alfred. They all became chemists, and the Ludwig's company eventually became ICI. The Goetzes were inextricably linked with the Monds. Emile married Angela Goetze, while his sister Constance married the painter Sigismund Goetze, who was Angela's brother. So here we have a photograph of Sigismund Goetze, and this is one of his paintings, which is a portrait of the young Francis with his younger brother Philip in 1904. Meanwhile, Sigismund and Angela's sister, Violet Goetze, married Alfred Mond. So here's Violet Goetze, who was the sister of Angela and Sigismund, and she married Alfred Mond, Emile's cousin. Sigismund Goetze, known to his friends and family as Siggy, was a friend of many important artists, including the sculptor Alfred Gilbert. He set up a trust to fund fountains for public parks, named the Constance Fund after his wife Constance. Ludwig Mond, Angela's great-uncle by marriage, left the largest bequest of Old Master paintings the National Gallery has ever received. You've probably heard of the Mond bequests at the National Gallery. Alfred, Angela's cousin by marriage, was the prime mover behind the inception of the Imperial War Museum and its first chairman. He became Minister for Health and was later First Baron Melchett. So this was no ordinary family. It had wealth and power and connections, none of which had saved Francis. But it did give Angela the wherewithal to turn feelings into form, to find ways to keep her lost son's memory alive. So I now just want to look at the memorials to Francis. As I said just now, Angela and her husband Emile erected a monument in the field in France where he had been shot down once they had discovered the burial place of his body. This was actually one of 4 memorials to him. In 1919, second memorial, they founded at his alma mater, Cambridge University, the Francis Mond Professorship of Aeronautical Engineering, an astoundingly new subject for the Tripos. Thirdly, they gave a bronze statuette of St. George by George Frampton to Lieutenant Hill, who had recovered their son's body from no man's land. And there are 2 casts of this sculpture. The version of the sculpture previously in the collection of Angela and Emile Mond, which is this one, is now fittingly in the collections of the Imperial War Museum, co-founded by Alfred Mond. It was actually bought by the museum in 1985 from a London dealer. It's inscribed in Latin with Francis's name and the date of his death, as well as the moving phrase in Latin again, from Emile and Angela, the proof of love. And then on the banner held by St. George is the badge of the RAF within a laurel wreath and the motto Per Ardua ad Astra, through adversity to the stars. And on the reverse is the badge of the Australian Commonwealth Forces with a laurel wreath bearing the motto Advance Australia. So the one on the right is the Australian version, which was presented, as you can see, in 1981 to the Australian War Memorial Museum by Lieutenant Hill's descendants. But the most significant memorial to Francis Mond is the monument in Storrington, with which we started, and which forms the heart of my talk today. Why was this magnificent sculpture erected in a small West Sussex parish church? Angela and Emile owned a townhouse in Hyde Park Square in London, but their country residence was Greyfriars, a house in the village of Storrington. Although they were of Jewish origin, the Monds seem to have been practicing Church of England Christians. So let's now look at the memorial of, to Francis Mond, which, as I've mentioned, is often unjustifiably overlooked by visitors to Storrington Church today. The main body of the monument consists of two polished carved stone panels inscribed "To the memory of Captain Francis Mond, Royal Field Artillery and Royal Air Force, 57th Squadron, who was killed flying over Bouzencourt-sur-Somme, France, while fighting several enemy aeroplanes on May the 15th, 1918, aged 22 years. Below is the RAF motto behind a fallen eagle, Per Ardua ad Astra. At the apex is a bronze relief of a woman cradling a dead youth in her arms, about half-life size. The monument is signed on the side at the bottom, G.R. Hoff, ARCA, Associate of the Royal College of Art. This is very difficult to see unless you are looking for it and know it's there. Although the monument is undated, we know it must have been erected in January 1923. In May 1922, a letter to Angela Mond from the rector of the church informed her that the drawing of the monument had been submitted to the diocesan committee in order to obtain a faculty for its erection. So these are some of the drawings for the monument, and this one as well. The rector wrote, "It is a beautiful monument. May it ever record your brave son, courage and gallantry, and that you, his mother, were one of the innumerable women who bore these gallant men and suffered with them the greatest sacrifice." The Monds paid 2 guinea fee for the monument to be erected inside the church. You can see from these contemporary press cuttings, for which I must thank Elizabeth Blood, that the memorial was installed in January 1923, and that the stone elements of the memorial were carved by the London stone masons Messrs. Hart and Hart. Only exceptionally are commemorative plaques or sculptures allowed to be installed within a church building in the 20th and 21st centuries, as many of you will know. This was evidently just such an exceptional case. The rector's letter makes clear the fact that it was Angela Mond above all who drove the commission of her son's monument, and that people recognised at the time of the First World War that the mothers of the young men who fought had endured appalling suffering. It was also erected before she had finally resolved where her son's body lay and had the records put straight. That, as we've seen, did not occur until a few months later, in April 1923. The sculptor of the monument was George Rayner Hoff. He was born just 2 years before Francis Mond, the young man whose memory he commemorated. Hoff had also seen active service in the First World War, joining up in 1915, probably at around the same time that Mond enlisted. He fought in the trenches and then went on to make maps based on aerial photographs, making good use of his skills as an artist. Hoff was of Dutch descent, born on the Isle of Man. Having initially been taught by his father, a woodcarver and stonecutter, he then trained in Nottingham and later at the Royal College of Art in London from 1918 to 1922. At the Royal College of Art, he was trained by Francis Derwent Wood, who recommended him as Director of Sculpture at the East Sydney Technical College in Australia in 1923. Hoff was to spend the rest of his relatively short life in Australia, dying there of pancreatitis in 1937 at the premature age of 43. His only known work in Britain, apart from the Mond Memorial, is a silver-plated bronze medal dating from 1922. The medal was commissioned by the National Federation of Fruit and Potato Trades Associations, and a silver-plated bronze proof of it was given to the Victoria and Albert Museum by George Swift JP, who was president of the National Federation of Fruit and Potato Trades Associations. So it was given actually the year in which it was made. This early work indicates Hoff's compositional power and his abilities as a draftsman. It also illustrates the fact that young sculptors could often more easily gain commissions for small-scale works such as medals rather than monuments. Why and how the Monds came to choose this young and comparatively unknown sculptor to make the monument to their son is unfortunately not recorded. Perhaps the fact that Hoff was not dissimilar from Francis, more or less the same age, and a veteran of the war, were factors. Possibly too, Hoff's tutor, Francis Derwent Wood, recommended him. Derwent Wood lived partly in the village of Amberley, 4 miles down the road from Storrington, and was almost certainly known to Angela and Emile Mond. This is the tomb to Francis Derwent Wood, which he designed himself. It's outside in the churchyard in Amberley, and it's a very, very fine bronze relief, as you can see. In addition, the successful artist Sigismund Goetze, Siggy, whom I mentioned before, was Angela's brother and was married to Emile's sister, Constance. He was fully immersed in the London art world and could well have proposed Hoff as the sculptor of Francis's monument. Even at such an early stage in his career, Hoff had exhibited at the Royal Academy in London and so was slowly becoming known as an artist. The monument was installed in January 1923, as we've seen, and Hoff left England for Rome on a scholarship in spring 1923, shortly afterwards, after the installation. Later that same year, he sailed for Australia, never to return. The design and power of the monument is irrefutable. The angel has a splendid fallen nobility, its upright wing pointing skywards to the fine bronze relief of the mourning woman holding the dead youth in her arms in the manner of a pietà. Is the woman intended to be an idealized portrait of the sorrowing Angela Mond? If her painted portrait is compared with the bronze relief, the similarity is striking. And you can also see under the feet of the woman in the bronze relief this word sacrifice. Although the fallen youth is a memorial to the universal soldier, he clearly symbolically represents Francis Mond. Like images of the dead Christ, and even classical sculpture, this is an eternal evocation of the tragedy and loss of a fallen youth, sacrificing his life for others. What must have been Hoff's preliminary three-dimensional model in clay, which unfortunately now seems to be lost and probably destroyed, for the sorrowing mother, expresses the idea of a pietà even more strongly. We saw Hoff's sketches for the monument earlier, and these show his thoughts as they developed, perhaps in conjunction with discussions with Angela and Emile. This one implies that the Monds may have originally considered a more elaborate outdoor memorial for the field in France as a freestanding monument. You can see here the strength of Hoff's draftsmanship, and in particular, the idea of the eagle as a central feature, as well as the mourning mother. The human sadness of the images on the Mond monument may be infused with a political protest at the futility of war, in particular the First World War. Certainly Hoff's later work in Australia was on occasion heavily criticised for its outspoken and brutal depiction of conflict, rather than emphasising heroism or patriotism. This is the Anzac War Memorial, designed by the architect Charles Bruce Dellett in 1932. It was actually erected in 1934, and the figures and relief on that monument were by Hoff. In the middle of the monument is a crucifixion, or rather a man laid out on a cross. And he is supported on a shield held up by his grieving mother, sister, and wife. And as I say, in a crucifixion-like pose. This is a public cry of anguish at the horrors of war, and the inclusion of female figures only stresses the agony and tragedy of battle, rather than the triumph of the victors. And it highlights the impact of war on women and the sacrifice that they made and still make. This group of the crucifixion-like pose young man was intended to be carved in Carrara marble, but the high cost meant that it was in fact cast in bronze instead. And the title of this work, Sacrifice, which you'll remember is the same word that was used under the bronze relief of the mourning mother in the Francis Mond monument. Hoff wrote of this monument in the Anzac Memorial, I tried to epitomise in this design the essence of war sacrifice. A great burden of pain, horror, and annihilation was laid on the youthful manhood of the nation. The quiet, continuous influence of women throughout the war was less obvious and received no honour, praise, or decoration. Thousands of women although not directly engaged in war activities, lost all that was dearest to them: sons they had borne and reared, husbands, fathers of their children, friends and lovers. They endured all man's sacrifice quietly. In this spirit I have shown them, carrying their load, the loss of their menfolk, the sacrifice of themselves. Deborah Beck's excellent biography of Rayner Hoff, which was published in 2017, notes that sacrifice was also the title of Hoff's earlier monument to Francis Mond. The ideas born in the memorialisation of the grief of a mother in England become echoed and amplified half a world away. But this painful representation of war would have been overwhelmed by Hoff's other sculpture originally intended for inclusion in the Anzac Memorial. He provocatively sculpted a dramatic and chilling group of figures, the Crucifixion of Civilization, depicting a young nude woman crucified over a mound of corpses at her feet. This caused such grave offence to the Catholic Church that the sculptures were withdrawn from the final work. The casts were put into storage, and then decades later, in 1967, were found to have disappeared, perhaps wantonly destroyed. Angela Mond could not, of course, know of Hoff's future career trajectory in Australia when she commissioned the monument to her son for Storrington. And Hoff's memorial to Francis Mond is not overtly a protest at the futility of war, but rather a melancholic and heroic memorial to a lost boy. As such, it epitomizes Angela's own grieving, and at the same time her energy and heroism in finding the body of her son on the fields of France, putting his soul to rest. The stone and bronze tribute to Francis Mond in a small West Sussex church publicly lauds his youthful valour, while simultaneously mourning the loss of hope for the future. Thank you very much.